Hollywood suffers from a very bad disease called sequelitis.
Hollywood is no stranger to nostalgia.
You take what grossed $100 million domestically last year and get the key ingredients back again and try to pump it up a few more times.
Now, of course, sequels and reboots are as old as time, but these days, originality seems way harder to come by. And in recent years, the quality of these movies have seemed to plummet.
Very rarely do you get a sequel that's an improvement on what went before it.
So how did an industry that was once so bold in its risk-taking devolve into a machine that plays it safe? But more importantly, is this even a bad thing? When I began my research, I always found the answer to this question quite underwhelming. When you pair nostalgia and Hollywood together, all you kinda get are people just pointing out that sequels and remakes just make money. I found myself kind of stuck. The two answers I would commonly find when you pair nostalgia and movies would be that they A, make money, or B, provide some form of escapism. I don't need to know why nostalgia is good. I need to understand why it completely consumes our culture. That was when I stumbled upon this article in The Harper by Daniel Bressner, titled The Life and Death of Hollywood. This piece goes deeper, and it honestly will serve as the framework for most of this video as to interrogating the why we have gotten to the place we've gotten to, and why it's so bad. The golden age of Hollywood was certainly a complicated time. For every great film, there was a horror story likely behind the scenes. But of course, audiences never knew about this because what was on screen was magic. At this time, most of the film industry was run by just 5 studios: MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Fox, and RKO. In 1948, their reign over the industry came to an end when the Supreme Court deemed the studios too powerful. They had a stronghold on the industry, having full control over production, distribution, and exhibition. So the Department of Justice issued antitrust suits that forced the studios to forego their control over exhibition.
The antitrust laws were called the Paramount Decree. This would mark the end of what would be the Hollywood studio system, thus marking the end of the golden age. So once the Paramount Decree hit Hollywood in the late 1940s, the country was gearing up to enter what would be a post-war prosperous 1950s. As the country entered the 1950s, the studios struggled, but this wasn't just because of the loss of the exposition rights.
Though it was certainly a major factor, the rise of quiet, car-dominated communities made theaters less accessible.
Thanks to the economic boom and the transition into the 5-day work week, families didn't really want to spend their weekends in movie theaters. They wanted to spend them with their communities.
Now, of course, the rise of television played no small role in this decline. Movie theaters were isolating, but at-home programming was a social activity. But Hollywood was always an innovative bunch, so they found a way to adapt. Studios would license their libraries to TV networks so audiences didn't need to leave their homes. But in case they did, there were new kinds of theaters and films being shown. By the end of the 1950s, 86% of Americans owned a television. Then in 1960, Hollywood writers and actors went on a historic double strike, something that'll likely only happen one time. The Screen Actors Guild re-elected 5-time union president Ronald Reagan to lead negotiations.
So the actors and writers went on strike mostly because they wanted their residuals extended for the work that's being played on television. Residuals were already in their contracts, but as TV boomed, they noticed that they weren't getting the money that they thought they deserved. And of course, the studios would go on to strongly oppose these expanded residuals.
But as Reagan and his team continued to fight, eventually they prevailed. Actors secured residuals for films made from 1948 and onward, and obtained funding to establish a pension program. By continuing to enforce antitrust laws into the 1970s, it would further help bolster the writing profession. In 1970, the FCC instituted FinCEN and the PTAR. These rules aim to target the network's ownership and financial interests in shows. The combination of the two was basically the Paramount Decree for television. Networks relinquished ownership stakes in shows and sought out the work of independent production studios that brought more socially relevant content to audiences. We also started to see the long-term effects of the Paramount Decree in the film industry. With the nation's culture shift in the 1960s and more young people started going to the movies, the new Hollywood movement was born. This is when European cinema's influence started showing up in American film. This also led to the rise of the American auteur as the country entered the 1970s.
But what the film industry would end up finding more valuable in the 1970s would be the blockbuster. No, not the video store, you goof.
I'm of course talking about Jaws, which is widely considered to be the first modern blockbuster. But it would be Star Wars that would ultimately influence the way that the industry values and utilizes franchises today, specifically through its use of merchandising. But in the decade that would follow, Hollywood would begin to shift in a new direction. As the United States entered the 1980s, a familiar face would come into power that would permanently change the entertainment industry.
Projection for the presidency. Reagan is our projected winner.
Forever. Okay, so Reagan was elected president in 1980 in a landslide victory. The country was moving to the right and Reagan was the figurehead of that. Now, one thing that was abundantly clear is that this was not the same Ronald Reagan that helped SAG get their pension and residuals. We're dealing with a different beast here. So Reagan's firing of 11,000 air traffic controllers would go on to set the tone of what his presidency would look like, signaling that this administration would push to weaken labor protections across industries. In 1983, the Department of Justice allowed HBO, Columbia, and CBS to form TriStar Pictures, combining cable, film, and broadcast companies in direct violation of antitrust laws meant to end vertical integration. Now we have this giant conglomerate coming together, and so what about the little guy? Those anxieties only grew in 1985 when the Department of Justice issued a memo stating it would no longer enforce the Paramount Decree, further encouraging major players to form conglomerates. Overwhelming sense of optimism that came with the Reagan 80s also made its way into more hollowed spectacle films as well. The new Hollywood was in the past now. Those bleak, sort of self-reflective films of the 1970s, gone, goodbye. Hollywood is interested in other stuff now. In the top 10 films of the 1980s, you will find 1 superhero film, 2 Star Wars films, 3 Indiana Jones films, and 1 Rain Man. Shout out Rain Man. It's really breaking the mold here. So quite different from the 1970s top 10 list. The top 5 films of the 1970s, with the exception of Star Wars, were all based on IP. The rest, with the exclusion of Kramer vs. Kramer at number 9, were original films. Every administration that would follow Reagan in the 80s would follow this practice of deregulating the entertainment industry. When the Clinton administration came into power in the 90s, the FCC repealed FinCEN. The LA Times wrote in 1992, "Indeed, one of the few public interest arguments that the networks used to support the FinCEN repeal was that, in the words of one lawyer from CBS, it would promote diversity." Excuse me? The belief that the television marketplace becomes more diverse if the rerun rights to MASH are held by a bunch of overpaid, middle-aged white males who dine at Luteith, instead of a bunch of overpaid, middle-aged white males who dine at Spago, is a very peculiar concept of diversity. Get real. The networks don't care about program diversity, they care about return on investment. Following this ruling, Viacom merged with Blockbuster, then took control of Paramount. Then, Disney merged with ABC to become the largest entertainment conglomerate in the world. So needless to say, vertical integration, very much back. And the difference between the golden age and now is that these companies are very strong. There are many new ways to get media in the hands of consumers now. By the 2000s, 6 enormous conglomerates ruled over the media landscape. They brought in over 85% of all film revenues and produced more than 80% of primetime TV. When the country entered its Great Recession in 2008, the government shelled out $7.7 trillion in capital in order to stimulate the economy. Piles of cash and cheap credit allowed asset management companies to run amok, leading to just 3 asset management companies taking over 88% of the S&P. In 2020, CNN reported BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street manage a stunning $15 trillion in combined assets, equivalent to more than 3/4 the size of the US economy. Now, Hollywood is fully in the hands of financial firms. As a result, these companies that used to prioritize long-term goals are now short-term goal-oriented. The obvious secret to great art is you can't really predict what audiences want. You kind of have to take risks. Now these companies don't want to take risks. Now they just needed to meet quarterly standards. This is how efficiency would take over Hollywood. What you see next to me is the symbol of what American film has devolved into. Oh my god, that's so terrible. In Alistair Maxwell's article, How the MCU Became the McDonald's of Cinema, he notes that since 2007, there have been 31 Marvel films with 11 more in development. For comparison, it has taken James Bond 61 years to make 27 films. On average, that's a new Bond film released every 2.25 years, and a Marvel movie released every 6 months. The year of the country's Great Recession in 2008 also happens to align with the release of Iron Man. By this point, the entertainment industry already realized that reboots and sequels can rake in a ton of money. It was almost always guaranteed box office success. Of course, there are outliers in between, but Marvel took this practice of using IP to a whole new level in what we'll be calling the McDonald'sification of cinema. Sorry guys, I'm still getting used to this YouTube thing. Did I use ification correctly? Let me know in the comments. Marvel popularized the idea of serialized movies. By creating a cinematic universe, Marvel would release multiple films a year, all with connected characters. Each movie acted as both a 2.5-hour action spectacle, but also a teaser for what you can expect in the next one. Instead of the discovery and journey that often comes with the filmmaking process, by having this system in place, the studio can promise a lot up front to quickly roll out in a short period of time. In order to appease the shareholders that now had control over Marvel Studios and most of Hollywood, Marvel reinvented the assembly line process that was popular during the studio system. However, there were two major factors that separated the golden age of Hollywood and this new Marvel style of Hollywood filmmaking. The first being a reliance on post-production today as opposed to during the golden age when they prioritized production and pre-production. Formerly, the world of a film would be built through matte paintings and live production design. However, now everything is filmed on a green screen, so it can sort of be an afterthought. Additionally, there's an over-reliance on the entire body of work today as opposed to just a singular film. Instead of promising audiences a strong 2-hour film, you're encouraging them to stay for the after-credits scene, to tease what's to come next in the long line of films. Maxwell describes how Sontag, if still around, would despise what film has become thanks to Marvel. He says, "The easiest way to cobble together a Marvel movie is to stuff it with things the audience already knows. Characters are bland, interchangeable, quip throwers. Big-name actors appear in cameos to break down the fourth wall and switch on the audience's dopamine producers through the power of recognition. Then characters from other Marvel films will appear, substituting movie magic for a, 'look, it's them' moment." This of course inspired other studios to dig into their libraries. Disney, who owns Marvel Studios, has been remaking their animated films for a quote-unquote new generation for years. By using familiar properties to the parents of the new generation, it incentivizes them to show their children, thus leading to more money. Sontag warned about a hyper-industrial film industry. She says that the point of great film is to be a one-of-a-kind achievement. But Maxwell notes that this likely isn't the goal of Feige and the Marvel team. Instead, it's likely what Don Simpson's corporate philosophy was when he was working for Paramount in the 1980s. The pursuit of making money is the only reason to make movies. We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make art. Our obligation is to make money. And to make money, it may be necessary to make history, art, or some significant statement. Disney held 8 out of 10 of the highest grossing films in the 2010s, many of which were comic book films. Now, of course, film and commerce are very much married together, and we'll return back to that. But just because these types of films are making money, this doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. By heavily leaning on the IP to sell tickets, this incentivizes studio heads to not back creative vision. Instead, they'll lean on their stars to sell tickets and CGI and VFX to quickly churn out a product. And while this may be successful, it often leads to a lower quality product. Yes. Yes. So during the 2000s and the 2010s, the domestic box office saw numbers it had never seen before. And of course, this was in no small part to the event films and franchises Hollywood had created. I mean, I showed out to them. I'm sure most of you did too. So if Hollywood was still making money, then why was this a problem? Well, the film industry, of course, was making money. Laborers suffered as a result. Look, not to be dramatic, but writers are some of the most important people to have ever lived. Not only do they create, but they preserve. At one point, writers used to make an incredible living in the entertainment industry. In the 1970s, if you were a writer staffed on a TV show, you made upwards of $175K a year. But as media companies began to consolidate through the end of the 20th century and into the new millennium, writers' bank accounts started to take a hit.
As conglomerates were growing, writers noticed that the royalties in their checks were shrinking. Because of this rapid growth of the companies, it became difficult to track where all the money was coming in and coming out of. Or at least that's what they said. Hollywood accounting refers to the sneaky financial tricks media companies use to make it look like movies and TV shows barely make any money, even when they rack in millions of dollars. By stacking on inflated expenses like sky-high marketing fees or internal costs, they can make the profits vanish on paper. This means creators, including writers, get smaller royalty checks. So ultimately, writers would then go on strike in 2007 to get better royalties for the home video market. However, the outcome was underwhelming. Being employed as a writer was still a great living. Since television was in its golden age, many people didn't really have sympathy for the writers at the time. But following the recession, things did get serious. In an effort of maximizing efficiency, companies slashed development funding. Formerly, writers would get what's called a multi-step deal. So this means they were paid to develop an idea, then write the screenplay, and then do rewrites. And so they would get paid for every step of that process. Now, since studios didn't want to waste money on development, they would get what was called a one-step deal. And it's exactly what it sounds like. You get one round of work for one round of pay. It also became common practice for novice writers or people who were trying to break into the industry to do cheap or unpaid labor. Now, of course, the irony of this is written on the wall. These companies are making more money than ever, but they wanted to pay people less than ever. And of course, even if these people who were doing that free work ended up getting paid work, they would now get paid less than they would in the past because of these one-step deals. Just truly wonderful stuff. Great stuff. So writers' fees began to plummet. And because of the industry's attitude towards writers at this point, this is really no surprise. But the reason this was actually happening was because the agencies that represented writers were now being acquired by the same companies that owned the studios. Today, the major Hollywood agencies make money not by maximizing their clients' earnings and charging 10% commission, but through direct payments from studios known as packaging fees, which are unrelated to their clients' compensation and come directly from TV series and film production budgets and profits. More recently, an even more overt form of conflict has taken root. The largest talent agencies have themselves formed production entities that hire and employ their own clients. These conflicted practices systematically favor the interests of the major agencies at the expense of their clients, and constitute a violation of fiduciary duty under multiple bodies of law. During a period of unprecedented prosperity for the major media companies, these conflicts have contributed to declining writer pay. In each of the last 3 years, the companies that dominate the entertainment industry, Disney, Fox, Time Warner, Comcast, CBS, and Viacom, generated more than $50 billion in operating profits. Meanwhile, television writer-producers' median weekly earnings declined 23% between 2014 and 2016.
But not only were writers' fees dropping, work now was even harder to come by. During the peak TV era of the 2000s and 2010s, writers were needed more than ever. The streaming boom started by Netflix creating a monthly subscriber model. By selling Wall Street on this model, this allowed them to gain a lot of capital up front to then produce high-quality content. But eventually that money ran out, and this method didn't really work anymore. The Hollywood Reporter said, "A wave of downsizing that kicked off last year when the priorities of Wall Street changed from a focus on subscriber growth to profitability." So the strikes last year were as a result of this streaming boom. And these tech companies that were coming in, who were sort of the new kids on the block, now absolutely dominated the film industry and basically completely disregarded antitrust laws. Netflix, for example, develops, produces, and releases their own content, and are not transparent on what content is actually being watched on their service. So writers and actors who made a large amount of their income from residual payments now saw a significant decline in these payments. In 2019, SAG-AFTRA made an agreement with Netflix that applied to any scripted projects produced and distributed by the platform. But because of this lack of transparency from the streamers, it made it easy for talent to be exploited. Shows like Friends, Suits, or The Office have lived entire second lives because of their accessibility on the streamers. The actors and writers would have been paid extraordinarily for its reruns on traditional television. This is why work is so hard to come by now, and why there's no longer a streamlined path to become a writer. Because when the tech giants came in, they essentially destroyed the career path that was created years ago. And because of this, there's really no training grounds to become a strong industry writer anymore. There's no streamlined career path anymore. That doesn't exist. So Bresner talks about this in his piece, but the way that we got prestige television was as a result of veteran TV writers kind of being fed up with the industry that they were in. So David Chase, for example, the creator of The Sopranos, wouldn't have created The Sopranos had he not been a working TV writer for years and had such a deep understanding of how the industry worked and how running a TV show worked. Mark Miller told The Guardian, "The crucial thing is that whoever is running the show needs to be both brilliant and experienced. They can structure the whole thing, keeping the big picture in mind at all times, plus do the heavy lifting and rewrites for the newbies. But now, writers' rooms barely even exist on TV shows, and they've instead been replaced by what's called mini rooms." Variety describes mini rooms as a miniaturized writer's room that hires 2 to 3 additional writers to help a showrunner crack the first 2 to 3 scripts after the pilot is written. And so since there's less writers being hired and their rates are dropping and there's less work, then they're not really working consistently. Now, because of this, writers need to find other work while also trying to break into a writer's room. So this leads writers to then go on and work at a restaurant or be a bartender or work in retail instead of working on their craft. This is why quality is dwindling. So I just want to highlight the fact that there have been some good movies to come out of this sort of nostalgic era that we're living in. I think most recently Barbie would probably be highlighted as like the greatest use of nostalgic IP in recent memory. But the thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that most movies are not Barbie. Okay, I don't think Barbie is some sort of beacon of hope for what we can get out of using IP and nostalgia. The irony of Barbie being such a hit and such a phenomenon is that, of course, the industry has sort of learned the wrong lesson from the movie and has decided to spawn an entire franchise of Hasbro movies, which is just, I don't know why that's the takeaway. The fact that it did so well, of course, people have a strong relationship to Barbie. It is very much ingrained in our culture, but I don't think that is everything that did it. I don't think it's just because it's Barbie IP. Actually, in fact, I know that's not why. I'm sorry. I'm going to make a firm stance on this one. That is not why people showed up to the Barbie movie. The reason people showed up is because of, honestly, the brilliant marketing, the creative cast and crew. It became a cultural moment, and it became that way because Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig were allowed to make the movie that they wanted to make. I mean, seriously, how many film franchises, as more movies are created, the movies just continue to get better? Take the Jurassic Park franchise, for example. All the movies combined cost over $1 billion to produce, and it has made so much of that money back. That is undeniable. Yet according to Rotten Tomatoes, since the original film, both audiences and critics agree that the quality of films have only gotten worse since the first one. But I just want to draw a line between IP abuse and adaptation. Some of the greatest films of all time were adapted from other IP. Jaws is a famous example of this. I think there is a difference between making Jaws and Jurassic Park, taking that sort of risk and then spawning a franchise out of its overwhelming success, than there is making a cinematic universe for the sake of making and churning out 30 plus movies. Those are two very different practices. And I hope that you watching at home understand that, because what those two movies have, at least in the first film, was a clear directorial vision by one of the greatest filmmakers ever. And he was quite simply given a task to direct a film, and he executed on it to the highest level. That cannot be said when you attach incredible directors to franchise films now, because directors are not able to really express themselves as a result of being held to a sort of uniform style. The original Jurassic Park film was not made with the intention of making a Jurassic Park film. That was the motivations of Jurassic World and so on. The goal of it was to quite simply revive an old property that made a lot of money to continue to make a lot of money. And they executed on that. Good for them. Now, given that this section is called good nostalgia content, there is, of course, exceptions to what I'm talking about when it comes to franchise films. The recent Planet of the Apes trilogy is some of my favorite franchise filmmaking ever. But I think when you look at the consistent top box office, you don't really find quality like this. More often than not, film franchises and nostalgia for those franchises is used as means to justify making bad films with the cushion of that intellectual property. The rediscovery of this assembly line process of making films has encouraged a quick production that often produces a poor outcome that, yes, makes a good sum of money for studios, but will often leave audiences dissatisfied. These mediocre films crowd the market, and with the lack of risk that studios feel like they are taking when producing these films, discourages them from making original content. In 2023, actors and writers both went on a historic double strike once again. Both actors and writers feared for the future of their careers with the rising power of the streamers and artificial intelligence. When the lengthy strike finally ended, the WGA received a minimum wage increase, a better residual system, and larger writers' rooms. Although the size of the rooms aren't what they used to be, it's still a step in the right direction. SAG-AFTRA also walked away from the strike with stronger protections against AI and a better payout for successful shows on streaming. Additionally, their new residual system is much better than before. As a result of what the actual future of the entertainment industry looks like, with deregulation or regulation, it's sort of extremely hard to tell. Personally, I like to think that things operate on a pendulum. Tastes are always shifting. We've been in this IP boom for so long that naturally, I think audiences as they grow older, hopefully, maybe it could be a reflection of the 1960s, will start to want more independent and reflective content. But regardless, there is still a plethora of good movies coming out. Artists will always try to find a way to tell the stories that they want to tell. Okay, while we're on this topic, I want to talk about The Brutalist, the film directed by Brady Corbett, the movie that a lot of you are probably going to see, at least by the time of the next Oscars. It's basically a story about the rise of an architect and his relationship with his beneficiary. The film is ultimately about the parasitic tendencies that relationship comes with. And he did this really interesting interview in The Hollywood Reporter that I just want to read verbatim. I think it's really an important look into the mind of the modern American filmmaker. I don't need as much money as people need to make movies. This film was made for under $10 million, but I need millions of dollars. That's very complicated because it means I often have to interface with people whom I don't share the same ethics and morals. Any filmmaker who would say otherwise is being dishonest. Because whether it's the studios or private equity, if you follow the money, it generally doesn't come from a great place. And so this relationship between the artists and their patrons is something that people don't talk about. I think the reason it's so taboo is that people are worried that if they talk about it, no one will write them another check, which means they won't be able to make more work and they're not going to be able to take care of their families. And I get that. Cinema for me is labor. I can barely keep my head above water financially. Most filmmakers I know in America, they live in one-bedroom apartments until they die. It's not a very lucrative medium. You work on something for years, you don't get paid much, or if you do, it's not enough money to live on for 4 to 7 years until you're able to get your next film off the ground. It takes a lot out of you. It's even worse for musicians, dancers, journalists. It's terrible for any artist today. We're living in a very disturbing moment in time where we are expected to do a lot more for a lot less. We have to fight to be able to do our jobs. I've had enough of it. I'm tired, you know? I wanted to end on this passage because I think it perfectly summarizes the overall message of this video. It is easy to be romantic about Hollywood and the film industry because it was built on the ideal of an American dream. But one thing that is inescapable about this art form that so many of us have fallen in love with, for better or for worse, is money. Filmmaking is a vaudevillian art form, one invented with the intention to shock and entertain. But even with the countless technological innovations made in the form in the over 100 years of its existence, making movies is expensive. You need a lot of hardworking people to bring stories to life. Writers were the primary subject of this video. But there are plenty of people in the industry that are searching for work every single day in Los Angeles. The entertainment industry feeds around $43 billion in wages into California's state economy. Yet wages dropped 20% last year. The LA Times published an article that further showcases the struggles that Los Angeles locals are facing every day. Even with all of this change and innovation that's happened in the industry throughout the years, the irony that I had hoped to highlight in this video is that because of this innovation, movies are harder than ever to make today. as a direct result of this innovation. In an art form that seems to be limitless, many films now cling to the past. Through exploring the history of the entertainment industry, we watch the rise and fall of quality cinema as a direct result of deregulation and corporate greed. But there's one last person who is to blame for the decline of film that I haven't talked about. You. The box office totals speak for themselves. While audiences seem to be aware of the nostalgia obsession in American films, we're still showing up. The film industry knows that audiences are slaves to the dopamine rush that come with nostalgia. When you see a new version of a character you loved when you were a kid, maybe it's an ode to a better time. But when does this end? At what point will the nostalgia machine run out? When will the rose-tinted glass of the past shatter and reveal the dullness of the present? With the new administration just days away from entering the White House, it's hard to say if any of this will change. But maybe that's for the good. Maybe this is what people want. Maybe movies are a dying art form. I fell in love with them when I was a kid. It was through superheroes that inspired me to further explore the magical world of film. But as I've gotten older, I've grown tired of watching the same thing. I almost feel betrayed. The very thing that I fell in love with is responsible for its own demise.